August 6th, 1945. At 8:15 in the morning, the course of human history was violently, irrevocably altered. A single B-29 superfortress, the Enola Gay, released a weapon unlike any seen before over the city of Hiroshima. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, silenced the bustle of a Monday morning. In an instant, 70,000 people were vaporized or crushed. By the end of the year, that number would climb to 140,000. For decades, the narrative surrounding this moment has been etched into history textbooks with absolute certainty. We are taught that the atomic bomb was a terrible but necessary evil. We are told that it was the only way to end the Second World War without a bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland, an invasion that would have cost over 1 million American lives and potentially millions of Japanese lives. The calculation is presented as a gruesome but simple equation: the bomb or the invasion, life or death. But history is rarely a simple equation. As the dust settled and classified documents were gradually declassified over the ensuing decades, a more complex, unsettling picture began to emerge. The story of Hiroshima is not just about military strategy. It is a story of geopolitical maneuvering, broken codes, internal political deadlock, and the dawn of a terrifying new age of superpower rivalry. To understand why the bomb was dropped, we have to look beyond the mushroom cloud and into the quiet, desperate rooms where the decisions were actually made. We have to ask the uncomfortable question: was it truly necessary? Or was Hiroshima the first shot of the Cold War, rather than the last shot of World War II? To understand the decision, we must first transport ourselves to the summer of 1945. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May. The war in Europe was over. But in the Pacific, the fighting remained savage. The battle for Okinawa, which ended in June, had been a nightmare of attrition. Kamikaze attacks were devastating the US Navy. The Japanese military, despite being strangled by a naval blockade and pummeled by relentless firebombing campaigns that had already reduced cities like Tokyo to ash, showed no outward sign of surrender. This is the context that President Harry S. Truman inherited when he took office in April 1945, following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman was new to the job, largely uninformed about the Manhattan Project, and under immense pressure to bring the boys home. The American public was weary. The prospect of Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November, loomed large. The estimates for casualties were indeed terrifying, though the 1 million figure often cited later was the most extreme of many projections. This is the standard history. It is the history of the decision that saved lives, and it is not entirely wrong. There's no doubt that American leadership believed the bomb would hasten the end of the war. But it is an incomplete history. It leaves out the parallel war happening in the shadows, the war of diplomacy and intelligence. By the summer of 1945, Japan was arguably defeated in every sense but the official one. Their navy was at the bottom of the ocean. Their air force was decimated. Their industries were crippled and their people were starving. The American Navy had effectively cut off the supply lines of oil and raw materials. American bombers roamed the skies over Japan with near impunity. Crucially, American intelligence knew this. The United States had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes, known as magic. Truman and his advisors were reading the cables between the Japanese Foreign Ministry in Tokyo and their ambassador in Moscow. These intercepts revealed a startling truth. Japan was desperately looking for a way out. They knew they could not win. The cables showed that the Japanese government was trying to mediate a peace deal through the Soviet Union, which was at that time still neutral in the Pacific War. There was, however, one massive sticking point. The Allies, in the Potsdam Declaration, had demanded unconditional surrender. To the Japanese, this phrase was terrifying. It wasn't just about military defeat. They feared it meant the removal and possibly the execution of Emperor Hirohito. In the Japanese psyche of 1945, the emperor was not merely a head of state. He was a living god, the embodiment of the Japanese soul, the kokutai. To surrender him was to destroy Japan. The intercepted cables made it clear that if the status of the emperor could be guaranteed, if he could remain as a figurehead, the Japanese military hardliners might be sidelined and the war could end without an invasion and without the atomic bomb. But Truman refused. The demand remained unconditional. Why? Some historians argue it was political momentum. After the atrocities of Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March, the American public wanted total victory, not a negotiated peace. Others point to a darker motivation, one that had less to do with Tokyo and more to do with Moscow. This brings us to the Soviet factor, a piece of the puzzle often glossed over in high school history. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 3 months after the defeat of Germany. That timeline put the Soviet entry date around August 8th or 9th. For years, the US had desperately wanted the Soviets to join the fight to help tie down the Japanese army in mainland China. But by July 1945, after the successful Trinity tests in the New Mexico desert proved the atomic bomb worked, the geopolitical calculus shifted instantly. Suddenly, the US didn't need the Soviets anymore. In fact, they didn't want them. American policymakers began to fear that if the Soviets entered the war, they would demand a seat at the negotiating table. They would want territory in Asia and influence in occupied Japan, just as they had seized control of Eastern Europe. If the war dragged on, the Red Army would sweep through Manchuria and possibly into Japan itself. From this perspective, the atomic bomb wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a diplomatic hammer. By using it to end the war immediately before the Soviet Union could make significant gains, the United States could secure sole occupation of Japan and demonstrate its overwhelming power to Stalin. Secretary of State James Burns was particularly vocal about this, noting that the bomb would put the US in a position to dictate terms at the end of the war. So when we look at the timeline, the coincidence is chilling. The bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. The Soviets invaded Japanese-controlled Manchuria on August 9th, the same day the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after. Was it the bomb that forced a surrender, or was it the realization that they were now caught between the American nuclear hammer and the Soviet anvil? Japanese historians often argue that the Soviet invasion was the real death knell. The Japanese military had prepared to fight an American invasion of the home islands. They had hoarded aircraft and fuel for a final suicidal defense. But they had relied on the hope that the Soviets would remain neutral or even help them negotiate peace. When the Red Army attacked, that hope evaporated. The two-front war was an impossibility. Even prominent American military leaders of the time harbored deep doubts about the bomb's necessity. This is perhaps the most surprising part of the untold story. 6 of the 7 5-star generals and admirals of that time earned their stars during World War II, and nearly all of them went on record stating the bomb was militarily unnecessary, morally repugnant, or both. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, usually the picture of pragmatic leadership, voiced his misgivings directly to Secretary of War Stimson. He later wrote, "I voiced to him my grave misgivings. First, on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly, because I thought that our country should not be the first to use this weapon." Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, was even more blunt. He wrote in his memoirs, "The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons." He went on to compare the use of the bomb to the ethical standards of the Dark Ages. These were not pacifists or revisionist historians writing decades later. These were the men who ran the war. They knew the condition of the Japanese forces better than anyone. They believed that the combination of the blockade, the conventional bombing, and the impending Soviet entry would have forced a surrender within weeks without a US invasion and without the atomic bomb. So, if the generals didn't think it was necessary and the diplomats knew about the peace feelers, why did it happen? We must consider the momentum of the Manhattan Project itself. By 1945, the United States had spent $2 billion, a staggering sum at the time, on developing the bomb. Tens of thousands of people were employed in a project so secret that Vice President Truman hadn't even known about it until he became president. There's a bureaucratic inertia to such massive endeavors. There was a feeling among some in Washington that having built the weapon, they had to use it to justify the expense to the American taxpayer and to Congress. As the saying goes, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Furthermore, the Target Selection Committee wasn't looking for military installations in the traditional sense. They wanted cities. Specifically, they wanted virgin targets, cities that had not yet been destroyed by conventional firebombing, so they could accurately measure the destructive power of the new weapon. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were spared conventional destruction, effectively to be preserved as test subjects. This scientific detachment adds a layer of cold pragmatism to the decision that is difficult to reconcile with the strictly to save lives narrative. The reality of what happened on the ground in Hiroshima challenges the sanitized version of events often presented. The bomb didn't just target soldiers, it obliterated a city of men, women, and children. The shadows burned on pavements, the rivers choked with bodies, the horrific burns and the radiation sickness that followed, these were the fruits of that decision. When the bomb detonated, the temperature at the hypocenter reached thousands of degrees. It created a firestorm that consumed everything. In the United States, the initial press releases described the bomb as a military triumph, a scientific marvel. The true horror of radiation poisoning was initially downplayed or censored. It took brave journalists like John Hersey, writing a year later, to bring the human cost of the bomb to the American public. It is also vital to look at the second bomb, Nagasaki, dropped just 3 days after Hiroshima on August 9th, the same day the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after. Was it the bomb that forced a surrender, or was it the realization that they were now caught between the American nuclear hammer and the Soviet anvil? Many historians argue that the bombing of Nagasaki was even more militarily questionable than Hiroshima. It appears to have been driven by an operational schedule rather than a strategic pause to allow surrender. The plutonium bomb used on Nagasaki was a different design than the uranium bomb used on Hiroshima. Some suggest the second drop was, in part, to test this second design in combat conditions.